The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar by solutionXchg on preparing for an S/4HANA migration utilizing SAP Data Archiving. We're happy you could attend and hope you will find the presentation interesting. My name is Jochen Hager and I will be your host throughout the session. Up front, a few administrative items. Our presentation today will take about 30 minutes with 5 minutes reserved for questions at the end. And a few procedural and technical notes on this. All participants are on mute during the full duration of the webinar. Please post any questions or concerns through the questions function in your administration panel on the right side of your screen. If you cannot hear us or cannot see the presentation, please also alert us through the questions panel. We will send out a transcript to those who are interested after the webinar. Please let us know via email to info@solutionXchg.com. That's info@solutionXchg.com. Let's dive right into the topic. Our featured speaker today is Dave Rogers, Principal Consultant and Data Archiving Specialist. Dave has many years of experience in SAP Data Archiving and has completed many successful projects with clients all over the United States. Dave, please introduce yourself and take it away.
Thanks, Jochen. The topic today is, as Jochen mentioned, preparing for an SAP or an S/4HANA migration utilizing SAP Data Archiving. So we know that these days S/4HANA migrations and questions around implementation, etc., is a pretty hot topic. So we're going to talk about how we can utilize SAP Data Archiving to help with that process. So if you're, hold on. Sorry, folks. All right, there we go. So if you're planning to move to S/4HANA, what all customers need to understand is that SAP charges for HANA based on volume. So essentially, the more data you have to process, the more expensive it's going to be. So the economics of SAP HANA or S/4HANA dictate that customers shrink the amount of data that they're putting into their S/4HANA system. So what this starts, or the question that this enables, is putting a value on your specific data, meaning creating a plan to archive older data that's rarely used, that's not critical to ongoing real-time operations. So essentially, the economics here dictate that you should implement archiving prior to an S4 migration. So we're going to talk about the process on how to do that. So essentially, there are multiple archiving drivers tied to an archiving project. The main drivers, and related to this topic, would be to reduce the total cost of ownership for these new in-memory systems, right? So the less data you have, the less it's going to cost you when you migrate over to S/4HANA. Another important driver would be to decrease the downtime during migration. So the less data you have, the less data you have to migrate. That's going to reduce the amount of time it's going to take for that effort. If you are in an ECC system currently and you're not looking to migrate over to HANA, you may be looking at database and storage limitation avoidance, meaning you have a certain amount of storage capacity and you don't want to buy additional storage to house your production data or pre-production data as well. You want to have that at a steady pace. So to avoid buying additional storage space and hardware, archiving is a good way to do that. Performance considerations and consistency and data storage volume predictability is also important. So, if you have certain pain points in your system, tables that aren't performing well, indexes that aren't optimized, etc., archiving can assist in that effort by reducing the size of the tables. you can rebuild the indexes with a smaller amount of data in those tables. Also, items to consider would be legal, audit, and regulatory requirements. So these are sort of hot topics in recent years around regulatory requirements. So you want to dispose of data after it has met its long-term retention. So typical retention times could be 7 years US, 10 years, potentially for European data, or even 15 years. But you want to make sure that when you're going through the process that you have a data retention plan and that you follow the long-term retention. So you don't want to keep data past its retention time, because then you are liable for that data. So it's important to follow your data retention plan and remove the data from your system at the time it is eligible to be removed, as long as it is not in a legal hold or still required for audit purposes. DART extracts. So DART is the data retention tool is used for tax and audit purposes. So you create extracts prior to executing the SAP archiving, and those extracts are used to report against if you have an audit. So there are also other tools available, third-party tools, etc., for that purpose, but that is also a consideration. You need to make sure that you have a tax strategy in place prior to doing SAP data archiving of that key data. Sustainable implementation is also important. So as part of this, we use SAP standard functionality for archiving and retrieval wherever possible. SAP archiving has been around since 3.1i and probably even before that, but I've been implementing projects all the way back to that early release. And the functionality of the archiving is relatively the same, with modifications throughout. But we are using standard SAP functionality to remove the data from the system. Essentially, it's the same process as the data comes in the system. We're removing it in the same way. We want to monitor database activity monthly and adapt our approach as needed. So we can continue to look at how our system is growing. Are we acquiring a company? Are we selling off a company? Is certain tables growing quickly? So you want to monitor your database activity monthly, and then you can adapt your approach as needed going forward. And with any project, we utilize documented, repeatable processes with key controls. So we want to make sure that when we're doing the archiving, that we are following the same process in a controlled fashion with verification steps, etc., throughout that whole archiving process. And the key here is what we all want to avoid is any negative impacts on the business. So by following a good strategy, by going through and working with the individual functional groups, we will determine what those gaps are in the process, which could get created by the archiving, and work to mitigate those prior to archiving. Okay, so the data archiving process itself is defined on this slide. So essentially what data archiving is set up by what we call an archiving object. An archiving object is simply a set of programs used to write the data to an archive file with specific checks within those programs to determine if the data is in fact archivable. And then the second program tied to an archiving object would be a delete program. So the delete program itself would read the data from the file system, then would go into the database and do a commit within the database for the data that it's reading from. And there's also a store job as well as part of an archive object. So if you are planning on not storing the data in your SAP file system or mounted file system, then you would set up a storage system, and the storage of the data would get automatically moved to the storage system from within SAP using the archive link functionality. storage systems that solutionXchg uses. They have a tight relationship with KGS, so we use the KGS archive server, and then we store the data on the back end in the ICAS media. So this is the whole process. So first the data gets written from the database, and it's selected and written here to the file system. The data itself, once it gets archived, is still accessible from within your standard SAP R3 system. So just because you are archiving data, it does not mean that you cannot retrieve the data within ECC. Now, the methods of retrieving in some cases will be similar to users. In other cases, it will be a separate transaction. So it really depends on the document that or the type of document you're archiving. So in SAP, there's probably 300, different archive objects that are available. But most customers would be implementing, a set of 20 or 25 different archive objects, which would handle approximately 80% of the database. So you utilize the 80-20 rule here with archiving. So when we look at archiving, you look at the information lifecycle management concept. We really want to focus here on the bottom. So when you're talking, some of the key terminology here is that we want to focus on is residency time and retention time. So with any document within a system that gets created initially, there'll be lots of changes through that happening to that document itself. After that document is closed or after it's been fully processed, it goes into a non-changeable stage. Then it gets to the business complete stage. During that time frame, the access frequency is quite high. Obviously, in that case, you wouldn't want to archive the data. But once it's business complete and it's been in the database for a period of time, then you may consider archiving the data at that point. So the point of creation to the time the data is eligible to be deleted is what we call residency time. So that is a key requirement for all of your data to determine, and that's the residency time. Again, that's from creation to the time it's eligible to be deleted. So for example, financial accounting documents may have a residency time of 2 years plus the current year. That means that a financial document would have to be in the system for 2 years plus the current year, and that document itself would have to be in an archivable status, meaning there's no open items tied to an account or a line item, et cetera. It has to meet all of the archiving rules tied to that archive object. So once it's met its residency time and you execute the archiving, it goes through the file system that over to the storage system, and access frequency should be quite low. Typically with archive data, you'll see spikes along the way if there's an audit, a lawsuit, a return, et cetera. And then once the data has met its overall retention time, let's say, for example, FI document, US data, more than likely would be 7 years. At that point, that's when the data would be destroyed on the back-end storage system or eligible to be destroyed on the back-end system. So that the whole life cycle is its total retention time. So this slide, I want to focus on considerations, archiving considerations for the process teams and for the technical teams. So if you are in a workshop type setting, if you're going through a project and you're meeting with individual functional groups, you have this subset of considerations that you would want to consider. So the first is obviously what to archive, how much, and when. That's sort of the overarching theme here. So the definition of online residency time can be differentiated by org unit, doc type, sales org, company code, et cetera. So you don't have to have a residency time, for FI document that's across the board, for 2 years. You could have differentiating residency times for different types of documents, etc. But that's one of the key requirements, is to come up with the online residency time, working with the business to determine when the data can be archived. Also, the definition of long-term retention and disposition criteria, again, that can be different for by organization, by country, with different regulatory requirements. So you really want to follow your data retention plan that your company has, and you can adapt that or adopt that as needed, and use that as the starting point to determine what your retention time should be. Timing for archiving. Archiving can occur pretty much at any time during the year. For example, maybe 3 months after a fiscal year end, if it's financial or controlling type data. So that's something that gets defined as part of the project, is when you're going to archive the data. What's the timing of that? And then the frequency of archiving. That's going to really depend on the amount of data which you're archiving. If it's IDOC data and you're funneling in huge numbers of IDOCs, inbound and outbound IDOCs, you may have to archive daily. And in that case, you probably are doing that already. And frequency could be monthly or yearly, whatever. So that's another key requirement or consideration that gets defined. Frequency and method of access to data exceeding the online residency time is also important. So determining how often people would need to look at the archive data, and then what methods do they currently use to look at the archive data. And then what we do as part of that process is, we show the specific SAP standard ways of retrieving that data, and then we are looking for gaps within that process and try to mitigate those as best as possible. Authorization access or restrictions to archive data relative to online. So typically SAP archiving follows the standard SAP authorization access model. So if you can't view the data today in the online database, you won't have access to the data in the archive as well. As we're going through the process of determining what data to archive, we need to look at consolidation of archive runs by groups of data. You may archive data based on company code, plant, sales org, purchasing orgs, etc. And that's just ways of grouping data that is similar. So you may have a set of company codes which have a 7-year retention. You're going to group that data together. So that's another thing to consider when you're coming up with the variants that you're going to use for the archiving execution. And again, data volumes can be challenging to archive programs and processes. So if you haven't done a whole lot of archiving and your database is quite bloated, then data volumes could be a challenge, just because the more data these archive programs have to churn through, the longer those programs are going to run in the system. So we try to keep the archiving jobs to within a specific archiving window, trying to keep jobs within a 4 to 6 hour window, but the larger data volumes you have, sometimes that is not possible. So this is just a subset of things to consider and key requirements that get determined with the business when you're having workshops, et cetera, and coming up with the requirements. Now we're going to jump over to the database analysis and archiving assessment approach. So whenever a project starts, this is typically the first step. You need to understand what your database and your system looks like, what you're going to archive, and come up with a strategy. So in this case, with a database analysis, we do an analysis of a customer's SAP system to determine data management targets, and also come up with potential archiving yields, meaning how much data are you going to archive out of your system. So as part of the database analysis, we perform that analysis against tables typically greater than 1 gigabyte, and that can be a huge number of tables. We look at top tables by size, fastest growing tables, also look at the top tables and the indexes as well, and look at the total data consumption with the indexes. We also look at custom tables as well. So if you have a whole lot of Z tables and Y tables, those tables do not get archived with a standard archive object. You would have to create a custom archive object or create a custom delete program to delete data out of Z and Y tables. So after you do all of that analysis, you have a listing of top tables and indexes, and you have worked with the client to determine what their pain points are, what tables they're having trouble with, what transactions. We take that list and map those tables and indexes to either an archive object or other data management methods. The other data management methods would be like housekeeping type tables, things like certain logs within the system, could be iDocs, there's a deletion program for that, spool data, etc. So there's a whole subset of tables that are out there that could use housekeeping deletion programs to help manage that data further. So we just don't look at archiving objects, we look at all methods to remove data. So after you do an overall look at the database, we perform a table analysis on the identified key tables. So typically you would look at an archive object, and you would look at the main header table, and then you would do a distribution of that across time. So you could apply key fields, let's say for FI documents, since I've been using that, controlling area, period, fiscal year, company code, and then you would look at the distribution across time. And that helps you determine, okay, if I archive up to year 2015, this is how much data is in that table for those specific years you're targeting. So once we do the overall analysis, specific table analysis runs, then we can build an archiving strategy from that point. An archiving strategy is simply a breakdown of archiving and data management targets into manageable phases. We list recommended phases, and what that includes is archive sequencing. So in some cases, there are specific rules around what order archive objects should be archived in. Sometimes your business process dictates what order data should be archived in. Also, we archive things in a specific manner to reduce potential issues and increase archive efficiency. So this is just an example of mapping data, mapping tables to data management methods. So you could see in this example, the top table is a profitability analysis table. So we have the total size of the table, the sum of all the indexes tied to the table. So we have a total amount here that would be handled by this specific archive object. So this is the COPA object tied to this table. In some cases, it gets a little bit more complicated, I should say in a lot of cases. So for example, COEP is the controlling table. There are multiple archive objects that can archive data out of COEP. So you may have to, there's further deeper analysis that needs to be done to determine what the source of the data going into that table is. So for example, in COEP, we could use the project archiving object to archive WBS data out of there. So there are multiple objects that can archive data out of there. So there's another level or a deeper level of analysis that needs to be done to determine what specific objects should be used here. And here's just an example. If we look down, we have SAP Office tables. So I'm sure most customers have a table out there where they're storing all their attachments within the SAP database, and those tables become quite large because you're storing all your attachments in the database itself. So we have the system lob tables that have SAP Office data, etc., so they can get quite large in a system. So this is just an example of a spreadsheet that gets created after the analysis. The archive object chart that we're seeing right here is an example of an archive strategy moving forward. So each color that you see is a phase within the project. So a Big Bang theory does not fly in archiving. There's not enough background processes in the system. You really want to phase out your project, do 4, 5 archive objects within each phase. So this strategy is essentially starting off with quasi-technical archive objects, things like work items, change documents, IDocs, table change logs, etc. Usually there's lots of data in those tables, and it's lower risk type archiving, so it's a good way to get your feet wet, and that's typically where we start any archiving project. The next subset of data here is that in this example is targeting financial non-tax relevant data. So typically for DART or tax reasons, you don't need to look at, profit center accounting. That's for your own reporting purposes, special purpose ledger, COPA. This is all for your internal reporting purposes. So we can archive this data before looking at or dealing with any tax considerations. So DART is and it's its own topic, but you need to, if you are running DART or you plan to run DART, those extracts need to be run prior to archiving data that is tax relevant, like financial accounting documents, material documents, purchase orders, sales orders, etc. All this is tax relevant data. So if you don't do the extract prior, then this data is no longer available for those extracts. So this is just an example of a strategy. So this is a multi-phase project going through all of these objects in a phased approach. And real quickly, I know we only have a couple minutes left. I just want to talk a little bit about the approach that is followed within the archiving process. So we do multiple steps here. We build the project team. We do the technical prep, meaning setting up the infrastructure, setting up the Unix directory, mounting that directory, might need to attach a separate file system, etc. Perform the customizing with this in the system so that we can prototype each of the archive objects. Perform the functional analysis, gap identification, gap resolution, and of course to cover ourselves, go through the sign-off phase. So all of these pieces that are in place here are used, our controls, our metrics are used to ensure that our expected results match our actual results. So we use that distribution analysis of key tables with control counts as part of our process. We are looking at determination and application of archiving rules, customizing our residency times based on our requirements, setting up each archive object and the technical settings around that. In the prototype and analysis, in non-production, we create the variants. So everything we do in quality, so typically we do about a 25% of the total volume in production in quality, because you want to identify issues in quality, not in production. So we set up the variants, we document the runtime metrics, how long the job took to run, etc. We are looking to identify any data issues. When we try to archive data, data issues can be prevalent and they get identified as part of the process. And then the rest of the steps here are really around process controls, reporting, reconciliation of our results, gap analysis, and then we follow the typical unit test, system test, which is the running of the jobs in the quality system and evaluating how that's being run, UAT, and then finally the move to production. So we follow this on every project, this set of structured tasks as we go through the project.
Thank you, Dave. This concludes the data archiving specific portion. I would just want to take a few moments to talk about SolutionXchg, and then we'll answer some of the questions we got through the questions panel. SolutionXchg is a a US solution provider focused on SAP imaging and data archiving solutions. We have a strong expertise with over 20 years of experience in the SAP implementation market around imaging solutions and data archiving. We are working with a few selected resellers and software providers like KGS and Eternity that provide us tools that we can use for our solutions to enhance existing functionality or make implementations faster, and be happy to talk about those more. You will find specific webinar topics in our selection on these other topics. If you are interested, just go to our SolutionXchg events page, and you will see either the recordings of past webinars or new webinar topics you can attend. And Dave, if you could move to the next slide, we will go into the questions. And here are 3 questions that we selected from the list of questions we got through the panel. First one, Dave, is why is data archiving before an S4HANA migration so important?
It's critical from the standpoint of from a cost perspective, and also relating to the time it takes to perform a migration. And also, one point I wanted to make about this is that any ECC archive data can be retrieved in your S4 HANA system after a migration. So I don't want anybody to worry about the fact of saying, hey, I got to archive all this data before migrating to S4 and then not having the ability to retrieve it. So you'll still have the ability to retrieve it, even though the data structures for material documents and financial accounting documents, et cetera, has changed. The system still has the ability to read the data from previous versions it was archived from.
Great. And moving on to the second question, how do I set realistic expectations for data archiving with my organization?
Okay, good question. Well, one thing is that archiving will not make your system infinitely faster, but it will, you know, increase the performance of some of your largest tables. So by going through and after your archiving process, and if you're archiving aggressively, you can reorg your tables and rebuild your indexes, and you will see an increase in performance. But it's not this windfall increase of performance, you know, what some people might expect. Also, you know, when it comes to implementation time, it does take a while to come up with the requirements, go through the testing phase with the business, create all the documentation and digital assets tied to the project and following the client's methodology, et cetera. So per phase, it can take up to 3 months and even longer. So it really depends on the client, but archiving can't just be, you know, you can't archive your whole system in a matter of months. It's just not realistic.
And a question that very much fits with the second question we had: who needs to be involved in a data archiving project?
Okay, excellent question. What I think is one of the most key resources would be a project liaison or project manager on the client side. But this person should have the skills or the contacts necessary to bring in key business users, key stakeholders, et cetera, at the times they're needed within the project. So really coordinating with the business users, bringing them into the project at the key points is one of the key members. Obviously, you would need key business functional users. Depending on what data you're archiving, you need those users to provide input relating to their specific business process, what transactions they use, what interfaces are tied to their business processes, et cetera. So it is critical to determine gaps and to understand the business processes to have the key business functional users who have that knowledge. Also, from a technical standpoint, the projects will involve the basis team, SAP DBAs for a period of time, storage resources when we're talking about, depending on where you're storing the data, if it's in a file system or if it's in a separate media, you need to work with your storage team as well. Also tied to an archive project, you'll eventually need to assign an archive admin to be the person to administer the archiving throughout the life of the system. So that's a key person that would need to be trained as part of the project and for the future runnings of and execution of the jobs. Obviously, an archive consultant to provide the details and the knowledge and to help set up the project initially. And then you also need to involve legal, audit, compliance team for data retention requirements, for understanding, if there is any particular legal holds on data, how your audits are performed, what data is typically required within an audit, et cetera. So that's the gist of the users that need to be involved in a project.
Thanks very much, Dave. This is great information, and I hope it helps all the listeners today to get their data archiving project a little bit more structured ahead of time. Please also feel free to contact us at any time at info@solutionXchg.com. That's info@solutionXchg.com. This now concludes our webinar. Thank you very much for attending. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and until next time, thank you very much. Bye-bye.